All right, good afternoon. Thank you for attending today's webinar on recent and pending updates to the Maryland Sentencing Guidelines. My name is Catherine Pembroke. I'm the Administrative and Training Coordinator for the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy, or MSCCSP for short. The focus of this webinar will be explaining how the MSCCSP completed a detailed review that culminated in a vote to adopt amendments to the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses effective July 1 of 2022. The goal of this webinar is to explain the purpose for the guidelines, to provide a rationale for the guidelines review, to summarize the pending amendments, and to bring transparency to the review process. A memo detailing the review process, implementation plan, and revisions to the sentencing matrices was distributed to the Commission's listserv on March 16th of 2022. Additionally, a guidelines e-news describing these pending revisions was also distributed to our listserv on June 1 of 2022. So for your review, both of these documents, as well as a PDF of today's presentation, will be uploaded through the chat box and can be accessed throughout the course of the presentation. Additionally, I have my colleague, Sarah Bowles, attending this webinar today. If you have any questions throughout the course of the presentation, please feel free to submit them through the chat box, and Sarah will be answering them. So before we begin, let's just briefly review the agenda for today's training. So to start, we're going to review a few of the basic principles regarding the Maryland sentencing guidelines. Then we'll discuss the MSCCSP's 2021 cell-by-cell compliance review process. Then we'll discuss the pending revisions to the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses in greater detail, including how MAGS and the guidelines calculator tool will account for these changes. And then finally, we will conclude by reviewing some other recent and notable updates to the sentencing guidelines. So let's get started by reviewing a few of the basic principles regarding the Maryland sentencing guidelines. The first is that the sentencing guidelines in Maryland are voluntary. So judges may, at their discretion, depart from the guidelines. They're also intended to be primarily descriptive. That is, the guidelines are intended to describe or reflect actual sentencing practices. The descriptive nature of the guidelines means that they are not intended to be static, but rather they are dynamic, and the guidelines may be amended when the data indicate that sentences are not consistent with the recommended ranges. So what do we mean by descriptive guidelines? Descriptive guidelines are those that are informed by analysis of actual current sentencing practices. Guidelines that are primarily descriptive are not intended to tell judges how they should be sentencing, but rather they're intended to illustrate to judges how their colleagues are sentencing on average for a typical case. And this is accomplished by analyzing recent historical sentencing data and using that data to inform or describe the guidelines ranges. Now, given the primarily descriptive nature of the guidelines, it's important to examine if sentences are consistent with the current guidelines ranges. Guidelines compliance review is statutorily required by the Commission's enabling legislation, and it's one of the primary responsibilities of the MSCCSP. The Commission's annual reports provide detailed analyses of compliance with the guidelines by crime category, judicial circuit, and other measures. Additionally, the MSCCSP periodically completes a more detailed cell-by-cell analysis every 3 to 5 years. And I'm going to take a moment to describe what's meant by a cell-by-cell analysis. So a cell is the grid intersection of an individual's offender score and offense seriousness category for drug or property offenses, or offense score for person offenses within the respective sentencing guidelines matrix. Now let's consider an example of a cell range from the current matrix for drug offenses. This is a partial view of the current drug offense matrix showing the recommended guidelines for seriousness category 7 offenses. Now I've circled here the cell which illustrates the corresponding grid intersection for offender score 3, seriousness category 7 offenses, indicating a recommended range of probation to 1 month. The cell-by-cell compliance analysis reviews data for the sentences from each of the intersecting grid cells of the 3 matrices to consider whether changes to the guidelines are warranted. The Commission's 2021 review examined single count sentencing data from calendar years 2018 to 2020. This timing allowed for the collection of 3 full calendar years of sentencing guidelines data following the Justice Reinvestment Act and the corresponding October 2017 revisions to the seriousness categories for many of the common property offenses and drug possession offenses. The analysis looked at average sentence and compliance by cell. Strict compliance considers a sentence compliant only if the sentence, and that's not including suspended time, falls within the recommended range, while regular compliance provides additional allowances for sentences involving corrections options, guidelines compliant pleas, and credited time. As a first step in the review, the subcommittee examined both regular compliance and strict compliance rates for each cell of the current matrices, with particular attention paid to cells with rates below the 65% benchmark standard and a sufficient sample size of at least 50 total cases. Now let's review what we mean by the 65% benchmark standard. The descriptive nature of the guidelines originated from the Judicial Committee on Sentencing that first developed and proposed the guidelines to the Maryland Judicial Conference. In 1991, the Sentencing Guidelines Revision Committee of the Judiciary's Guidelines Advisory Board established an expectation that 2/3 of sentences would fall within the recommended sentencing range, and when sentencing practice resulted in departures from the recommended range in more than 1/3 of the cases, guidelines revisions should be considered. Now, based on this previously adopted policy, the Commission then adopted the goal of 65% as the benchmark standard for sentencing guidelines compliance. Findings from the first step of the review were first reported at the May 2021 Commission meeting. The first step considered compliance and strict compliance by matrix and cell. The primary takeaway was that most of the cells with at least 50 cases are meeting the 65% compliance benchmark, as regular compliance was below the 65% benchmark and only 2.2% of all cells across 3 matrices. However, when considering strict compliance, more than 1/4 of those cells have compliance rates less than 65%. Further, in the majority of non-compliant cells, departures below the guidelines exceed departures above the guidelines. The next step in the review was to examine where the middle 65% of sentences fall for each cell. Now, by identifying the middle 65% and considering revisions to more closely align with the middle 65%, we achieved 2 things. First, we know that the 65% compliance benchmark will be met if we identify the range that captures the middle 65% of sentences. Second, we know that the middle 65% will reflect the average or middle sentence for a particular cell while excluding outlier sentences on either end of the range. Accordingly, the guidelines will help inform about the average sentence for a typical case. Now, this graph illustrates the middle 65% for the intersecting grid cell of the drug matrix for seriousness category 3B offenses with an offender score of 1. The blue portion of the graph illustrates the 496 sentences in calendar years 2018 through 2020 in this particular cell. And as you can see, most of the sentences fall in the range between 0 months to 18 months. Although not illustrated on this graph, another 17.5% of sentences are at 0 months, and an additional 17.5% are above 18 months. In instances where the lower limit of the middle 65% is probation or 0 months, as it is with this particular cell, this simply indicates that the bottom 17.5% of sentences is also probation. The current guidelines for this cell are set at 1 year to 3 years. But as you can see, a smaller percentage of sentences fall in the current range. This middle 65% analysis was completed for each of the cells in the drug and property matrix. The next step of the review considered proposed amendments to the drug and property matrices and examined how compliance rates would change with those revisions. The proposed revisions strike a balance between a strictly descriptive middle 65% of sentences, the number of months in each range, and the proportionality of ranges across cells. The pending revisions move the guidelines substantially closer to the middle 65%. However, they do not correspond strictly to the middle 65%, as they also offer proportional incremental increases going across the matrices as the offender criminal history increases, and down the matrices as the offense severity increases. The proposed amendments to the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses were then presented for a vote at the Commission's November 10, 2021 meeting. And at the time, the Commission voted to tentatively approve the amendments pending public comment at the December 7, 2021 annual public comments hearing. To note, the Commission decided to address the drug and property matrices before considering changes to the more complex person matrix. So whereas the drug and property matrices base offense severity on the offense seriousness category, the person matrix factors in the additional elements of victim injury, weapon presence, and victim vulnerability. Potential revisions to the person offense matrix may be considered at a later date. Now, the proposed amendments to the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses were posted on the MSCCSP website and were published in the Maryland Register in advance of the December 7 public comments hearing. Further, the Commission distributed a call for comment on the proposed amendments to an email distribution list of more than 1,500 criminal justice practitioners and interested individuals. After receiving input on the proposed amendments at the public hearing, the Commission voted on December 7th of 2021 to officially adopt the proposed amendments to the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses. Now, these pending amendments will officially go into effect on July 1 of 2022. So let's take a closer look at how the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses will be revised effective July 1. So I'll start with displaying the current and pending revisions for the sentencing matrix for drug offenses. So as you can see, row 1 in the black font here, it provides the current guidelines range. So this will continue to be the recommended range for cases sentenced before July 1, 2022. Whereas in row 2, the red font provides the revised guidelines range that will take effect for cases sentenced on or after July 1 of 2022. So let's consider an example of an offender with no prior criminal history, so that being an offender score of 0, who was convicted of distribution of cocaine, a seriousness category 3B drug offense. So as we can see in the intersecting cell highlighted here with a green circle, the current recommended range is 6 months to 3 years. And then effective July 1, the revised range will become probation to 9 months. Let's take a look at one more example, this time specific to the revised property matrix. So again, we have row 1, which is the current guidelines range, with row 2 in the red font providing the revised guidelines range. So let's consider an example of a defendant with a prior criminal record score of 2, who was convicted of 4th-degree burglary, which is a category 7 property offense. So as we can see in the intersecting cell highlighted here with the green circle, the current recommended range is 3 months to 9 months, and then effective July 1, the revised range will become probation to 6 months. So as highlighted in the 2 examples I provided, and just generally speaking, the sentencing guidelines for drug and property offenses were revised down to more closely align with the current statewide average sentences. The pending guidelines revisions amend the guidelines to more accurately reflect recent sentencing trends and to more closely align the guidelines with how judges are currently sentencing based on analysis of sentencing guidelines data. The revisions in their entirety, they're detailed in the matrices for drug and property offenses that were provided on the last 2 pages of the memo that was sent via the chat box at the beginning of the presentation. They're also in the e-news that was uploaded to the chat box as well. So next, I just want to address a few of the common questions that were raised at the time the revisions were initially proposed. The first question being, are the pending revisions intended to reduce sentences for drug offenders, particularly those convicted of drug distribution? And the answer is that the pending guidelines revisions are not intended to reduce sentences, and revisions to the guidelines are not intended to change sentencing. Rather, the revisions amend the guidelines to more accurately reflect recent sentencing trends. So in other words, the revisions more closely align the guidelines with how judges are currently sentencing. And I want to emphasize that the sentencing guidelines are not intended to say what judges should do or to say what sentences the state should be recommending. The guidelines, again, are intended to reflect the average sentence that is actually imposed or has been actually imposed based on analysis of sentencing guidelines data. Further, it's important to remember that the guidelines remain voluntary and judges retain the option to sentence above or below the guidelines when the facts of the case call for an increased or decreased sentence. Now, do the pending revisions reflect sentence discounts due to the COVID-19 pandemic? And the answer is no. The MSCCSP specifically examined this question.
Barely warm.
The analysis identified that approximately 13% of sentencing events in the 3-year time period from 2018 to 2020 occurred during COVID, and there were very few differences in strict compliance by matrix and cell when those sentences were excluded, with strict compliance rates generally varying by no more than a few percentage points. So in summary, the inclusion of 10 months of data from the start of the pandemic does not alter guideline sentencing trends for this 3-year time period. And therefore, the MSCCSP included all sentencing events for calendar years 2018 through 2020 to maximize the number of sentencing events informing the review. Next, do the pending revisions reflect sentencing trends statewide, or do they reflect sentences from 1 or 2 larger jurisdictions? And the answer is that the pending revisions are based on analysis of statewide sentencing trends. The guidelines are intended for use statewide and are not intended to reflect jurisdiction-specific sentencing. Now, there was some concern specifically that the pending guidelines for the 3B drug offenses may be skewed or too heavily influenced by sentences from the 8th Judicial Circuit, as it accounts for a disproportionate number of 3B drug offense sentencings. Accordingly, an analysis was completed to examine the sentences for 3B offenses separately for the 8th Circuit versus all other judicial circuits. This analysis found that the average sentences in the 8th Circuit do trend lower. However, the sentences in other jurisdictions also trend lower than the current guidelines ranges, confirming that pending revisions were warranted. Further, the pending ranges are more aligned with the sentences from the other jurisdictions than the sentences in the 8th Circuit, which should eliminate the concern that the pending revisions are being driven by trends from a particular jurisdiction. Now, in accordance with the July 1, 2022 effective date, the Maryland Automated Guidelines System, commonly referred to as MAGS, as well as the Guidelines Calculator tool, were also reprogrammed in order to account for the revisions to the sentencing drug and property matrices. Since guidelines worksheets are often initiated in MAGS several weeks in advance of sentencing, effective June 1 of 2022, an alert message now populates, as you can see in this screenshot here, when calculating guidelines for an offense seriousness category and offender score combination, whose guidelines range will be revised effective July 1. Practitioners will select whether the sentence date will take place on or after July 1, 2022, and the guidelines will be calculated accordingly. Now, please note, should the date of sentencing be postponed or moved up, the guidelines will be automatically updated to correspond to those in effect based on the sentencing date entered on the GLS overall sentence tab. Now, as with any changes to the sentencing guidelines, the Commission must promulgate the pending revisions to the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses through the Code of Maryland regulations. Promulgation is a multi-step process occurring over several months, and regulations do not become effective until the end of the process. Now, at this point in time, the Commission has completed many of the necessary steps of promulgation and is in its final step of formally adopting these regulations by submitting a notice of final action to the Division of State Documents for publication in the Maryland Register. Regulations may not become legally effective until at least 10 days after publication of the notice of final action. Given these necessary steps, the effective date for final adoption of the revisions will be July 1, 2022. So as I noted earlier, a guidelines e-news detailing these revisions was distributed to the Commission's listserv on June 1, and a second email will be distributed to criminal justice stakeholders in advance of the official effective date, as a reminder of the pending guidelines revisions for all circuit court cases sentenced on or after July 1 of 2022. Now, for anyone who's interested, we have a couple of resources pertaining to these pending revisions to the sentencing drug and property matrices, which can be accessed from our website. As I mentioned earlier, on March 16, 2022, a memo detailing the cell-by-cell compliance review process, implementation plan, and revisions to the matrices was distributed to our listserv. It can also be accessed from our website at the address noted here. The guidelines e-news distributed on June 1 can also be accessed at the address noted here. And then finally, MSCCSP staff will be holding additional webinars throughout June to highlight these pending revisions. So if you have any colleagues who may be interested in attending this webinar, please refer them to our training page for registration. So now that we've reviewed the pending revisions to the drug and property matrices, I just want to quickly highlight some other recent and notable updates to the sentencing guidelines, as well as an upcoming update that may be of interest. The first update to review is the reclassification of third-degree sex offense. On September 14th of 2021, the MSCCSP voted to revise the seriousness category for sex offense third degree involving age-based elements in light of, 1, concerns from multiple practitioners that the previous seriousness category of 5 was too low, and 2, an analysis of sentencing data that identified sex offense third degree involving age-based elements as the offense with the highest rate of sentencing departures above the guidelines. Therefore, effective February 1 of 2022, the seriousness category has been revised from a seriousness category 5 to a seriousness category of 4. The second update to review pertains to the scoring of victim injury points in child pornography cases. Part B of the offense score, victim injury, instructs that 2 points shall be scored for person offenses if victim injury occurred and the injury was permanent or resulted in the death of the victim. In response to testimony provided by an assistant state's attorney at the MSCCSP's 2020 public comments hearing, the Commission voted to adopt revisions to the Maryland Sentencing Guidelines Manual and COMAR to instruct that permanent victim injury points shall be awarded in cases involving evidence of child pornography. Specifically, the revisions provide the added instruction that effective October 1 of 2021, offenses involving photographic or video evidence of child pornography shall be scored as permanent victim injury. This language is intended to apply permanent victim injury points to any offense involving photographic or video evidence of child pornography and is not limited to convictions for the possession, manufacture, or distribution of child pornography. For instance, this rule may be applied in cases involving the following types of offenses if evidence of child pornography is present: sexual solicitation of a minor, sextortion, visual and camera surveillance of a private place, obscene matter, prostitution, human trafficking, or electronic harassment. The revisions recognize that photographic and video evidence of child pornography often exists in perpetuity, and the victims of these crimes suffer lasting psychological consequences and are re-victimized every time an image is viewed, possessed, or distributed. Lastly, I just want to quickly discuss an upcoming update. At the Sentencing Commission's May 10th meeting, the Commission voted to revise the offense type classification for arson first degree from a property offense to a person offense. This reclassification means that arson first degree will include the scoring of the additional elements of a person offense, including whether there was a victim injury, presence of a weapon, and whether a victim was a vulnerable victim. The Commission voted to adopt this reclassification to reflect the substantial risk of harm that arson first degree poses to dwelling inhabitants, as well as first responders. This revision will be promulgated through the COMAR review process and is expected to be adopted effective October 1 of 2022. So I will wrap up by highlighting just a few of the Commission resources that we have. The first being our Commission website, which is continually updated throughout the year at www.msccsp.org. It's a really useful resource for those individuals who implement the sentencing guidelines. The website includes annual reports that are a great source to learn more about recent sentencing trends and the work of the MSCCSP. I also want to highlight our guidelines e-news, which helps to inform about changes to the guidelines. Many of you may already subscribe to our listserv, but if you do not and are interested, if you can just send us an email to our general email account, which I'll show at the end of the slide here, just simply provide your contact information and request to be added to the listserv, and we will be happy to do that. More recently, we just started producing a series of topical mini reports titled Sentencing Snapshot, included to provide a quick review of sentencing trends and other topics of interest. So this most recent issue of the Sentencing Snapshot provides a closer look at sentencing trends in Maryland, circuit courts for marijuana offenses. So as you can see, my colleague Sarah, she actually takes the lead on these. She does a fantastic job. They're very informative. We've received a lot of positive feedback. So again, if you subscribe to our listserv, you're probably receiving these via email, but we have these on our website as well, all of the issues, if you have interest in taking a look at those. We have PDFs of our guidelines manual and guidelines offense table that can be accessed from our website. The website also provides access to MAGs and the guidelines calculator tool, as well as instructional training videos for these applications and general training webinars on calculating the guidelines. You can access those videos from our training page or on our MSCCSP YouTube channel. If you simply just go to YouTube and type in MSCCSP, you'll see our channel pop up with all of our videos. The commission staff, here's a screenshot of our training page here where you can access those videos as well as any upcoming webinars. That's where you can register for them. The commission staff, we also provide a help desk. It's manned from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day during the work week, and we're available to answer any questions regarding the guidelines that you may have. So you can always feel free to give us a phone call or send us an email to our general email account at msccsp@umd.edu. So at this point, that concludes the webinar. I just want to quickly check in with Sarah to see if we have any outstanding questions or anything that needs to be addressed before we conclude.
No, I don't see any outstanding questions here.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So I'll just give any of the participants just a second. If you have any questions that you want to either submit through the chat box or you can take yourself off mute. We'll see if there are any outstanding questions. No. Okay. Well, at that, I just want to thank you all for your participation. I hope you found the webinar to be informative. If you did, please let your colleagues know that we have a couple of webinars still happening throughout the course of June. So if they just head to our training page, they can register there. So thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.